One of the earliest, if not the earliest, measurable feature in the Alzheimer's brain is impaired glucose metabolism. And impaired glucose metabolism essentially is what characterizes type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, an inability of cells to, let glucose enter for use by the mitochondria for fuel. In people that have Alzheimer's disease, mild, moderate, severe Alzheimer's disease, 100% of them have insulin resistance in their brains. And so if you connect the dots, there's all these metabolic tie-ins. And then there's research into ketones, which you alluded to before, which I think is so fascinating. The idea that ketones can sort of provide this sort of energetic backdoor to these metabolically ailing brain cells.
You were talking about the animal chow that they use in these.
Yeah, I can't help myself when I see a study come out that says, with a headline like high-fat diet, awful for human health or something like that. You look, you inquire a little further, you see that they're animal studies, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but these high-fat diets, what are these high-fat diets that they're being fed? Are they diets that are rich in olive oil and phytonutrients from, dark leafy greens? No, usually, and I've gone to the manufacturers of the rat chow, they're usually 50% lard and 50% maltodextrin, which is pure glucose, essentially. It's a glucose polymer. It gets converted almost instantly to glucose. And that's the problem. And so what happens when you lump sugar and saturated fat under the umbrella of a high-fat diet, I think that's where people get confused. But I'm actually very much in favor of a diet that's high in healthy fats.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about ketosis a little bit later, but just want to do a quick introduction. Folks, we're here with Max Lugavere. Today we're going to talk about brain health and nutritional strategies that we can optimize brain physiology. And I know you have a personal story, which I think we can share a little bit later, but you're doing an awesome documentary, Breadhead, I believe is what it's called. So we're going to dive into the details of that. But we're here in your apartment here in Manhattan, and one thing I noticed, we were talking about this offline, is in New York, there's so many people, the population is really dense. We can see everyone's shopping cart, at least in Whole Foods, right? And a lot of folks are eating bread and cookies and crackers, and on the outside they're lean and look healthy, but on the inside we know this is causing a metabolic train wreck, and particularly for the brain. So let's make that connection with eating grains and carbohydrates and how that affects brain health and cognition.
Yeah, you bring up an amazing point, the idea that just being skinny doesn't mean you're in perfect metabolic health. The absence of disease does not equal the presence of health. And so I think that actually a lot of what's fascinating is that a lot of patients with Alzheimer's disease are actually underweight. And getting these patients to gain weight is a major challenge for caregivers. But that just goes to show you that underneath the surface, there could be, metabolic dysfunction happening. And that's where I think really eating a healthy diet, whether or not you're of normal weight, is so important.
Right.
And bread, grains, I think most people tend to overdo it with the grains. I like to say that we're in the midst of an epidemic of blood sugar, and we're more sedentary than we've ever been. We're sitting at desks all day, or we're sitting in our cars. I spend a lot of time in Los Angeles. I'm in the gym an hour a day, and I work my butt off in the gym, but other than that, I'm fairly sedentary. It's not a pedestrian city. I'm sitting in traffic 3 hours of the day. So the idea that anybody in that situation should be just eating the 7 to 12 or whatever servings it is of whole grains a day, causing blood sugar to skyrocket, to me is just crazy. So yeah, that's why I think that these ideas are relevant to everybody. Whether or not you're a type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic, I think that, the studies, continue to show that one of the best ways to stay as insulin sensitive as possible is by not only eating a low-carb diet, but a diet that's really high in fiber, to nurture gut bacteria, that's high in, certain micronutrients, abundant in healthy fats like omega-3s and not as high in omega-6s. I think over the past century, I was reading, there's been a 1,000-fold increase in omega-6 consumption.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. So we've got these inflamed bodies, and, the brain, going back to your question, the brain often sits downstream of a lot of these inflammatory processes. We tend to think of our brains as sort of sitting atop the throne of the body, immune or shut off or whatever to the body down below. And there's justification for maybe thinking that way. There's no pain receptors in the brain. We can't feel inflammation in the brain the way we feel an inflamed knee joint, for example. But the brain really does bear the burden of a lot of this sort of inflammation. And that's why I think that, like, you know, being mindful of that is so important.
I want to make this connection, though. I think people don't understand this. I mean, when we talk about type 3 diabetes, you know, and talk about Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment and so forth, people just think like elevated blood sugar and diabetes. They don't really make that connection between elevated blood sugar and brain dysfunction and brain shrinkage. So I know you've interviewed some of the researchers that have done some of the science and so forth. So what's going on there? How does blood sugar cause the brain to shrink and cause neurologic dysfunction?
Well, so nobody knows what the first thing that kicks off the cascade that will ultimately lead to Alzheimer's 30, 40 years down the line is. You know, we have scanning technology. We can look at glucose metabolism in the brain. And when I say we, I mean scientists. I'm not a scientist.
Right.
I'm a filmmaker. But I, you know, obviously I'm obsessed with this topic. And you know, for the past couple of decades, there's been this prevailing hypothesis of what causes Alzheimer's disease. And that hypothesis, called the amyloid hypothesis, basically took one of the most salient features of the Alzheimer's-ridden brain, this sort of buildup of amyloid plaque. And they basically put that as the center, the bullseye of pharmaceutical research for an Alzheimer's cure. The idea being that amyloid plaque is the cause of the disease. And decades of research and drug trials have found that that might be the wrong road that scientists are sort of going down, because there's been very little successes. And you know, in people with Alzheimer's disease, they can measure amyloid load, which is the amount of plaque buildup in the brain, and there's very little correlation between amyloid load and actual cognitive ability.
Wow.
That being said, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, measurable feature in the Alzheimer's brain is impaired glucose metabolism. And impaired glucose metabolism essentially is what characterizes type 2 diabetes, you know, insulin resistance, an inability of cells to, you know, let glucose enter for use by the mitochondria for fuel. And what they found is that in young people, carriers of the ApoE4 allele, which is the gene that's most associated with increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. It's not a determinant gene, but it's a gene that you know, tends to confer greater risk in people that carry it. They found that even in people that are decades, you know, before showing symptoms, cognitive symptoms, that there's this impaired glucose usage in those brains. And then at the other end of the spectrum, and those people may never go on to develop Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
But on the other hand, at the other end of the continuum, in people that have Alzheimer's disease, mild, moderate, severe Alzheimer's disease, regardless of whether or not they have that allele, 100% of them have have insulin resistance in their brains. And so if you connect the dots, you know, again, this type 3 diabetes moniker is a hypothesis. It hasn't been proven that this is what causes Alzheimer's disease, but it's one of the sort of burgeoning hypotheses behind what leads to the disease. And in fact, there's been a lot of corroborating evidence. So before we started rolling, we were talking about Suzanne Kraft down at Wake Forest University. You know, she's doing a lot of this research. There's a handful of these scientists that are really, you know, publishing incredible work in this space. She's one of them, and she's found that insulin resistance in the body predicts amyloid buildup in the brain. In fact, she's published trials with Oriel Willett, who's another guy who I want to interview for my documentary, where long-acting insulin nasal sprays have boosted cognition in patients with Alzheimer's disease. Yeah. Really so there's all these like metabolic, you know, tie-ins. And then there's like research into ketones, which you alluded to before, which I think is so fascinating. You know, the idea that ketones can sort of provide this sort of like energetic backdoor to these like metabolically ailing brain cells. So I think it's really exciting, and I think it's mostly exciting because it's empowering, and it gives us a way to sort of integrate safe dietary recommendations into our lifestyles that will not only minimize our risk for type 2 diabetes, which having that doubles your risk for Alzheimer's disease. But you know, again, these are safe recommendations, and they'll benefit the brain. I mean, you know, like the brain is fed blood by 400 miles worth of microvasculature.
Wow.
And what's good for the heart, what's good for the metabolism is good for the brain. So that's why I just think that all these things are so important to know about, especially when you know that changes begin decades before the first symptom, as with many of these chronic diseases. So it's not just Alzheimer's disease, but it's many of these non-communicable chronic diseases build up over months or even years. The treatment options are so limited that prevention is the new frontier. It should be.
Yeah, you mean the conventional treatment options, pretty limited.
Conventional treatment options are very limited. Yes.
Yeah. And what's scary, you mentioned that the pathology, this dysfunction occurs years before the disease really manifests or can be diagnosed, which is really scary because we see, type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset diabetes, and now we're seeing children that are pre-diabetic or insulin resistant. So it's scary to see, to think about what's going on in their brain and other tissues of the body while their metabolism is becoming dysregulated from really, or poor dietary advice, from eating breads and cookies and crackers and grains and so forth.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's the sugar, it's the refined carbohydrates, it's the chronic elevations of blood sugar, it's the fact that we're way too sedentary, and it's the fact that we're not eating enough vegetables, So occasionally I'll have a grain, I'm not brown rice is not the devil, I'm not saying that brown rice is toxic, although some people do think that there's a lot of arsenic in brown rice and so it should be avoided for that reason. But I think that we need to use carbohydrates accordingly and titrate it, our consumption of them up or even way down depending on our activity levels. I have a friend who's an MD who, this is a fairly revolutionary idea in terms of how mainstream medicine considers carbohydrates, but they should be thought of as performance-enhancing drugs. If you're having a weight workout and you're depleting your muscles of glycogen, have your carbohydrates after your workout. But the fact that we're eating these we're just inundating our systems with blood sugar from sun up to sundown, to me is just highly problematic. I was reading a study today about how it was a randomized controlled trial looking at fish oil and executive function. And one of the things that they measured was insulin and total gray matter volume in the brain. And at the end of this 6-month study, those who had lower levels of fasting insulin had greater volume of gray matter in their brains. And, lest we forget that Alzheimer's disease is characterized by dramatic brain shrinkage. Size matters in the brain. And here we are seeing that, that insulin, having dramatically elevated insulin, correlates with, correlation is not causation, but correlates with a smaller brain, Yeah. So, and then on the other hand, as you're well aware, there's all these metabolic costs of having constantly elevated insulin. We stop, we prevent ourselves from manufacturing ketones, which are a really clean burning fuel sources, as we mentioned. So, yeah, I just think that time to get back to some sanity, in terms of, our food choices.
Yeah, well, let's get back to carbohydrates you talked about, and I want to circle back eventually to ApoE4 and we'll talk about ketones, but you mentioned carbohydrates, and I was looking at your Facebook to kind of prep for this interview, and you talked about carbohydrate loading. There was a study I think you shared from a recent article. So I totally agree with you in terms of people should use carbohydrates commensurate with their physical activity. If they're not keto adapted or they're not in ketosis. But I think people get dogmatic about it and they want the diet. When should I eat this carb? So let's talk about metabolic flexibility and the problems with excessive. You kind of mentioned it, but what did that study show about carbohydrate loading? I was kind of curious on that, what it does to the brain.
Yeah. Well, I think that we tend to be in the morning. We're at our most insulin sensitive, right? Cortisol is also very high. Cortisol is a hormone that insulin is the storage hormone. And cortisol sort of liberates, fuels for the body to use. I think that by not eating carbs in the morning, it provides a great means of enjoying that sort of mild ketosis that many of us may find ourselves in when waking up. And it also allows our bodies, as you mentioned, this chance at experiencing metabolic flexibility, which we've evolved to be able to experience. A lot of people, like, there's a great T-shirt that I saw recently at Urban Outfitters. I'm sorry for all the things I said when I was hungry, or something like that. Hangry, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something that I used to experience. When I ate a lot more carbohydrates, I used to, like, in those moments where I was going a little bit hypoglycemic, I would get really irritated and agitated. And now that I eat a predominantly low carb diet, unless I've exercised and I feel like earned those carbohydrates, I don't really experience that hanger. So, like, when I wake up in the morning, I can go for hours without eating and I feel totally fine. And to me, that, is a sign of metabolic flexibility, which is a surrogate for, I would say, metabolic health, the ability to go into fat stores and use that for fuel, which is like something that it's an amazing adaptation that we evolved over millennia to be able to do.
It reinforces what you were talking about earlier, and one of the adaptations, the pathological adaptations, I should say, when you become insulin resistant is that loss of metabolic flexibility, right? And so you can't go between meals very long because, your blood sugar dysregulation becomes, the valleys and dips become more exaggerated. But I was reading a clinical study that looked at high-fat diets and how we actually store fat in our intestines and chylomicrons for like up to 12 to 18 hours. So it's really cool. Yeah, I was really surprised by that. So it kind of goes into what you were saying about how you don't feel like you can go longer between meals because you're eating a higher fat diet. And so it's really unique in that our body has a greater buffer zone. And so kind of to dovetail into that is intermittent fasting and how beneficial that is for our metabolism. Do you kind of want to weave that into this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think intermittent fasting is incredible insofar as it's yet one other means by which we can induce this state of like acute physiologic stress, which again is something that, like, we've evolved these like hardwired incredible adaptations to be able to cope with that we undermine by eating constantly throughout the day, especially carbohydrates. And so intermittent fasting is one of those things that, has been shown to do many of the same things that exercise does. It boosts BDNF in the brain, neurotrophic factors that, are depleted in Alzheimer's disease and even depression, that we can sort of upregulate by going hungry a little bit. It actually has an epigenetic effect in that it like turns on certain genes that are involved in, really incredible reparative, protective mechanisms. So intermittent fasting, I think, is super beneficial if you're healthy enough to do it. Obviously, metabolically healthy. I think diabetics who need to use insulin, it's not advisable for them. But I think that's a great. You kick on, something called autophagy, which I think is super exciting. This ability to sort of clear up senescent cells that have become damaged and sit around secreting pro-inflammatory cytokines. There was a study recently where I think through gene editing, they enhanced, the ability of mice to clear senescent cells, and that coincided with like a dramatic increased lifespan and health span in those mice. We all have these like cells in our bodies, and clearance is like a major thing. And so fasting provides this one mechanism by which we might clear up those cells. And there's different protocols. There's Krista Varady studies. She's a researcher who studies this sort of 5 days feeding, 2 days fasting protocol. A protocol that I use is it's the 8-hour feeding window followed by a 16-hour fasting window. I initially got turned on to that by this website, leangains.com. He's like a personal trainer who applies fasting principles to body composition and stuff like that. But I think Mark Mattson he's done a lot of research in fasting. But I know that there's evidence that daily eating, but just within a restricted time window, has shown to be beneficial. And so that's a kind of fasting that I regularly practice. I don't do it every day because I think as soon as your body adapts, it ceases to be stressful in that positive way. So, but again, like the only way that you're able to do that without becoming hangry and without wanting to commit homicide to the first person that stresses you out, I think you've got to be metabolically flexible. And the best way to do that is to eat a diet that is, lower in carbohydrates, higher, because you need to replace those carbohydrates with something, so higher in healthy fats. I don't think you want to replace it with, you don't want to replace those carbohydrates with protein. You want to replace them with, fats and fiber and things that keep you satiated, that we know that we're not getting enough of. We know that 90% of adults in the US aren't eating enough vegetables. We know that there's widespread deficiency of magnesium, things like that, which is sort of like a surrogate for vegetable consumption because it's at the center of the chlorophyll molecule, magnesium. So yeah, I mean, I think that like you were saying that people want like an actionable like diet, I mean, I think like vegetables first. I don't think, this is that revolutionary, focus on dark leafy greens, which, the consumption of which is inversely correlated with risk for dementia, according to the Mind Diet research published in Alzheimer's and Dementia. And fill your plate with healthy sources of fat, extra virgin olive oil. I just did an interview with an oleologist, like a globally renowned olive oil expert, and the benefits of olive oil are just, really profound. Polyphenol rich, incredible compound.
The hydroxytyrosol I've read a lot about in the brain too.
What's that?
It's one of the polyphenols found in olive oil.
Oh man.
Yeah, so there's some good research there. But
another thing about olive oil that I was reading that's so fascinating is that there's a compound in it. I don't know the full chemical name, but the acronym is DMB. How can you forget that? I mean, I think I was definitely a fan of Dave Matthews Band growing up. That's an acronym that they found that it suppresses this compound in cold pressed extra virgin olive oil called DMB, suppresses the microbial fermentation of carnitine, which is an amino acid found in red meat, into this atherogenic compound called TMAO, another acronym that I can't possibly remember the full chemical name for. But that's one of the mechanisms by which, red meat, there's a few mechanisms, but one of the mechanisms by which red meat might confer an increased risk, overconsumption might confer an increased risk for heart disease. I mean, we know that grass-fed organic red meat is not unhealthy, but all the signs seem to be pointing to this idea that the more your microbiome can sort of represent the microbiome of a vegan, that enables you to sort of eat meat and not have an exaggerated response to it, a way that predisposes you to disease. And so olive oil has one of these like really cool compounds in it
that inhibits the bacterial enzymatic conversion. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. That's really powerful.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Some good data, because that really confuses people. I remember when that study came out in Nature in like 2013 or something.
I've been obsessed with it. Yeah, there's a great book by a microbiome researcher named Jeff Leach called Rewild.
We had him on the podcast.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he's awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've never met him or anything, but I've been fascinated with that since I read that study, because it just to me it doesn't make sense that meat, which has so many brain building compounds in it, from preformed DHA to to being a great source of protein, to creatine, B vitamins, creatine, B12, things like that, could be bad for you. And so I was like, I've just been obsessed with that TMAO link, and so I think that in with the diet, we don't eat these isolated food groups, or these isolated foods, I should say. We eat patterns. Mm-hmm. And in a diet that's rich in extra virgin olive oil, I think, red meat might be totally healthy, A diet that's high in omega-3s, grass-fed omega-3 rich red meat could be totally benign. In fact, there was a study that I posted yesterday that they found in mice, don't know the dose of resveratrol, but that resveratrol from red wine had a similar effect, that it sort of morphed the microbiome favorably to lead to less TMAO production.
Interesting. I'll have to dive into some of those studies. Yeah, because that leaves people, kind of confused, and that's one of my qualms, I guess, with the whole paleo thing. Is I think people really overdo the animal protein, right? And because it's bacon fat, and they take butter to the next level, and butter and coffee, butter for a snack, and take, there's not a lot of emphasis sometimes. I'm not saying across everyone, but it seems like from the posts I see on Instagram. So I'm glad you're highlighting that. So folks listening, eat paleo, but make sure you overcompensate with the phytonutrients because they affect the microbiome in a positive way.
Yeah, part of I know you because I stumbled on a video of you explaining this sort of translocation of, bacterial endotoxin across the gut epithelium by way of saturated fat, right? And so that's like one of those things where like if we're eating tons and tons of saturated fat in the context of the standard American diet, I mean, that is going to promote inflammation. Right. There's like no question. So the idea that like your average person plucked randomly out of the United States who's eating a diet that we know is really nutrient deficient, throw more butter into their day, like that's going to lead to problems. However, in the context of a diet that's rich in omega-3s and plant fiber and things like that, then I think it's totally fine. And the studies have shown that omega-3 prevents that translocation. So there's all these nuances, but I don't think it's as complicated as people think it is. I think it's just like, you want to eat a mostly plant-based diet. The meat that you get should be sourced from like, responsible farms that feed their cows what cows want to be fed.
Right.
And, we can all be healthy.
Yeah, move more, and we'll talk about that. But let's go back to the transition a little bit to ketosis.
Yeah.
And what I find really fascinating about ketosis is it kind of mirrors the metabolic effect linked with fasting. Like if you look at AMPK and PGC1 alpha, all the mitochondrial pathways are also upregulated with ketosis. So for some people, if they don't want to fast because they're not metabolically flexible, what have you, and so let's talk about ketosis specifically for the brain and some of the neurogenesis and BDNF and all that. And ways that you found experimenting, like what are some like hiccups, tips you want to share with that?
Yeah, well, I think that coconut oil is a great daily thing to integrate into your diet for the chance at converting these medium chain triglycerides to ketones. They provide a very ketogenic fat. Eating a low carb diet, like ketogenic diets have been used for centuries to treat epilepsy, in part because they reduce inflammation in the brain. There's evidence that in these brains that are displaying impaired glucose metabolism, that providing ketones to them can sort of turn the lights back on. Mary Newport she's an MD, but her husband had really dramatic Alzheimer's disease. He recently passed away, but she's published case reports about dramatic improvement in, it's an N of 1 study, but she fairly rigorously documented this case. And there have been other researchers to look more thoroughly at the applications of ketones in neurodegenerative disease. Stephen Cunnane does a lot of this research. Essentially, the brain will use ketones in proportion with what's in plasma. So if you are ketogenic, if you are manufacturing ketones because of a low carb, a severely carbohydrate restricted diet, if you're in mild ketosis because you haven't, eaten carbs since 8 p.m. the prior night and you're, starting to manufacture ketones, or you take a shot of coconut oil, I mean, the idea is that your brain is going to use these ketones. You're not going to be manufacturing nearly as many of them without being in a severely carbohydrate restricted diet or, in starvation. But again, in brains that have showed this impaired glucose metabolism, as early as the second decade of life, I think it provides a really interesting potential way of providing this sort of alternate fuel source. And like so much more research needs to be done, so it's not like this is settled science, but it's really hard, I would imagine, to find funding to study coconut oil, for one. But that being said, there is an FDA-approved medical food on the market prescribed for patients with Alzheimer's disease called Axona, which is like an MCT-based food product. And the whole idea, you need a prescription to get it, and the whole idea is that it supplies medium-chain triglycerides, which turn into ketones in the liver to fuel these metabolically ailing brains. So I think it's super fascinating, super interesting.
But let's come back to how you kind of introduced this. You talked about ApoE4. That genotype lends an increased risk. It's correlated, right? But I don't think it's causative of Alzheimer's.
It's not a determinant risk. It's not a determined gene. It's a risk gene.
Risk factor, right? Yeah. But we know that there's some fat dysmetabolism associated with that. And I know, I remember Berkeley Heart Labs back in 2010. They recommended ApoE4s eat a lower fat diet. Is that right?
Yeah, there is some thinking that that ApoE4s over-respond to saturated fat, to certain fats, and they have a sort of more exaggerated like LDL response from that. On the other hand, the best way to reduce LDL is to minimize inflammation in the body and eat a lower carb diet. So, so again, I think that the science really isn't. They don't know. That's the thing. It's like they don't know. So I mean, has all the research been done in humans with these, ApoE4 genes, with these various dietary patterns? That research is being done right now. Actually, a friend of mine who's featured in the documentary up at Cornell is doing this kind of research. But ApoE4s, they're unique, and there's a lot of unknowns. Like in some of these coconut oil, or I should say MCT oil studies, they didn't respond as well. Some think that the level of ketones weren't high enough for those ApoE4s to really get benefit from them. So I think there's a lot of unknowns. But that being said, I think that there's one paper online where that the author calls ApoE4s the canary in the coal mine of the Western way of life. So I think that really, if you are a carrier of this gene that puts you at greater risk, I think maybe make sure that you're getting all of the omega-3s that have been shown to help people with mild cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease, and whatnot. Eat a diet that's minimize inflammation.
That's the other aspect we haven't really talked about, but that's important to figure out. So it's not so much, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but just to kind of conclude that, it's not so much that it's all fat in general, but it's specifically saturated fat is linked with increased prevalence of.
There's mixed opinions and there's no consensus.
Yeah,
okay. So some people think, especially in the ApoE4 community, think that ApoE4s are best keeping saturated fat to a minimum. And there's no requirement to consume saturated fat, so maybe if you want to try that out and go to your doctor and get your lipids tested, then that's a great recommendation. I don't know of any recommendation to watch total fat content, although I can tell you this isn't fat, this is cholesterol, but a recent study, a very large study, found that eating cholesterol in unrestricted amounts didn't affect cardiovascular risk markers even in patients with the ApoE4 allele. So they were included in that study. And for a long time, cholesterol was one of those things that ApoE4 carriers were sort of hesitant to consume. So, I wouldn't. Again, I don't make sort of medical recommendations to people, but if I were a carrier of the ApoE4 allele, I would probably eat a diet that, again, minimized inflammation and was still high in vegetables, high in healthy fats. I wouldn't avoid saturated fat. I would just make sure that if I were consuming it, it was from sources that were healthful, I would make sure that if I was consuming saturated fat from a piece of steak, that it were a grass-fed piece of meat that came replete with omega-3s that we know can mitigate some of the inflammatory consequences of consuming a diet that's really high in saturated fat.
And then it was cooked okay as well, because the whole cooking process and ages and ridges we can get into.
Yeah, although I think that most of the AGEs are created endogenously, the ones that we want to be careful of. I don't think that, I think the studies that I've read show that only about 10% of exogenous AGEs cross into the bloodstream. In fact, there's a great study that was done where they looked at they measured AGEs in vegetarians and omnivores, and the vegetarians actually had more AGEs.
Wow.
Yeah, and they speculated that it was because they were eating a lot more fruit. Fructose has 10 times the glycating potential, as glucose does. And I think that it's just an inherently higher carbohydrate diet. I mean, you can eat a vegetarian diet and have it be healthy for sure, but again, going back to AGEs, I think that most of them are created in the body by way of high carb diets. And
Interesting.
Yeah.
Max, let's kind of finish up a little bit on optimizing brain function and brain health. I know you have a relative with dementia, and so what have you found? I mean, we've really, I think, covered pretty well the nutritional aspect of it, but we know novelty, speaking a different language, learning, playing instruments, exercise, circadian rhythm, sleep. I mean, there's a whole myriad of different factors, right, that affect inflammation and metabolism. Have you figured out, just an N of one, what seems to really play an important factor in terms of cognition? And
really good question. I have not had a ton of, it's really hard to shift how a person feels about nutrition when they went through decades of being afraid of certain macronutrients.
Yeah.
So that's very difficult.
Meaning fat, of course.
Meaning fat. Yeah. And the person in question is my mom, she's a New Yorker, born and raised, grew up on bagels and things like that. And so to her, a bagel, piece of bread will always be benign, if not totally healthy. And I just think that, not saying that those are the things that led to what she is experiencing, but she's also from a generation that didn't really value exercise the way that we do. I mean, when I was growing up, there were no public gyms like there are now. And my mom never really exercised. Things like that. So it's like a constellation of things. I think what I've seen is that exercise really is medicine for the brain. I know that the more she's exercising, the more her spirits seem to be lifted, the more she seems to have display greater energy. But yeah, man, I've become so focused on the idea of prevention. Like I'm gonna help my mom as much as I can, but when you know that this is like a decades-long disease process, whatever it is that we're talking about in terms of neurodegenerative disease, I mean, whether it's vascular dementia, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, I mean, these diseases, the genesis occurs over decades. And so to me, it's just so important to really evangelize and embody these principles now, when our brains are still super plastic and we really can, make a difference in our cognitive health. So, but yeah, I think exercise is incredibly important. Keeping the mind active, like novelty, as you said, I think routine is a killer, Going back to intermittent fasting and, the things that we were discussing before, I think that there's this bumper sticker that, says life begins at the end of your comfort zone, And I think that really health begins at the end of your comfort zone. I mean, I think that to be comfortable really is the antithesis of some of our best hardwired capabilities, whether it's the stress that you put yourself through from a hard workout, or by going and getting lost in a strange city where you can't pronounce the street signs, to learning a new instrument. I mean, these are all things that that stress our bodies in a way that's profoundly beneficial, Not talking about chronic stress. Chronic stress is obviously very bad for us. But yeah, I think getting out there and doing as much as you can, so important.
Beta amyloid in the immune system.
Beta amyloid in the immune system.
Well, I mean, I just heard Dr. Perlmutter at one point talk about beta amyloid being like an antimicrobial protein and tau protein and so forth. And so it brings up there's this whole hygiene hypothesis emerging when it comes to autoimmunity and allergies and inflammation. So there was some speculation, or I don't know if it's correlation or the mechanisms have been teased out, but that beta amyloid may be linked with, maybe it could be protective and protecting the brain against some sort of intruder. And so we know periodontal disease and poor oral health is linked with greater plaque in the brain and so forth. So have you, in this documentary making and so forth, kind of looked at some of that research?
I think it's so interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't done a total deep dive into that topic yet. I know that there is some thinking that amyloid is sort of an antimicrobial compound. I'm not sure that scientists really know what its purpose is in the brain. Again, we all make it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's super interesting. The plaque thing in the mouth that you brought up, that's really fascinating. I have been reading about the oral microbiome recently, and it is really interesting that, we do have these gram-negative bacteria in our mouths.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's one of the reasons why bad oral health is linked with cognitive decline, and it's been linked for decades to heart disease and things like that. But they've actually measured, I believe, levels of serum endotoxin after chewing. That just chewing, if you've got poor oral health, can cause this release of bacterial endotoxin into the bloodstream by way of the mouth, by way of the oral microbiome.
Wow.
Which is really interesting, because that's something that we definitely don't want to happen at the lower end, like in our colon, in our large intestines, But that the mouth could be an entry point for that, I mean, it's just really interesting. So I don't know if that, I mean, there's been links with other sort of viruses and things like that. That all that stuff I'm not too familiar with, but I do think that the oral part of it is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a point to kind of pause and emphasize, because people are always, the gut is so popular right now. I mean, the gut, it's almost a kitchen table topic, right? I mean, everyone's talking about it, but we do forget that it starts here, right? The entire alimentary canal is all connected, just like the whole body's connected. So great point there. And eating a food or eating a diet rich in vegetables and healthy fats and protein is going to be supportive of the oral microbiome, right? So
yeah.
It's all congruent. Yeah,
healthy fats for sure. I mean, that's the new lens from which we have to assess all of our nutritional choices these days, which I think is so interesting. I mean, before really taking a deep dive into the microbiome, I would say, well, what's so bad about saturated fat? Saturated fat's not bad, but the thing is, with every meal we have this opportunity to nurture the gut health, and I think unless we're eating a diet that's really high in nutrients, omega-3s, things like that, which I am, and I know that you probably are, the idea that we should just be consuming more and more and more saturated fat, I don't think is necessarily the answer for that reason. Although, again, I think it's healthy. It's not the dietary demon that it's been sort of pegged to be for the past couple of decades, but it is biologically active. It does have this role in the body where, it affects our cholesterol levels, our lipoprotein levels and things like that. And the more sugar we're eating and the more LDL we have around to be oxidized, it's the body's like this intricately complex thing. And it's not just saturated fat. Is it good or is it bad? Well, it's good depending on the context in which it's consumed. So I think that's just the level of nuance that I think people need to consider before just throwing butter into their smoothies and things like that.
Yeah, interesting you bring up butter, because butter is a source of fat for a lot of people, but it also does have dairy antigens and so forth. And we know that dairy, paradoxically, I'm sure you're familiar with this research, it's low glycemic, but it does spike insulin, right? So there's some interesting correlations there. So have you looked at some of the data that you've studied and so forth, the correlation with dairy and neurologic issues?
Yeah, well, I've been looking at dairy. The data on dairy and cognitive decline is mixed, inconsistent. There's not really a lot there. I have been really interested lately in casomorphins, and I know that bovine dairy has been, I don't want to butcher this, but first of all, there's a few things that, one thing is that it slows transit through the gut. So that's why people tend to feel constipated when they eat cheese. I haven't eaten cheese in years. I just intuitively had the sense not to consume dairy. I think I'm a musician, so a lot of musicians that I know, like singers, don't eat dairy because they say that it creates mucus. And I've always been curious about that. Does dairy create mucus? And if so, how? Why? So it turns out that these casomorphins do actually stimulate mucus production. And it's an interesting kind of mucus that is really only secreted by these goblet cells in the gut epithelium in response to inflammation.
Wow.
So it's this really interesting thing. It also slows passage of contents through the gut, which again can have an effect on the microbiome, population down there. And there is an interesting, I don't want to butcher it because I don't remember exactly the specifics, but I know that there's because of the casomorphin thing, which is like, they're very comparable to opiates, as the name sort of, implies, that there is a connection with autism, and I don't know exactly what that is, but yeah, I've been
kind of creates like a psychological addiction to the dairy, and then a paradoxical aberrant behavioral type effect is what I've heard from different practitioners.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
So I think I don't. Dairy is not something that I consume.
So you'll do more ghee instead of butter, for example.
Yeah. I've got a huge jar of ghee in my house. I love it.
Yeah, and my wife makes it. It's pretty awesome.
That's awesome.
Max, we talked about how stress is good, right? How like getting up in front of people and doing public speaking, getting on video, playing an instrument, whatever it may be, cold stress. But we know that winding down and meditating, there's a lot of beneficial research. It's pretty exciting to see. I recently came across a meta-analysis that showed that regular meditation is linked with increased telomerase, reduction in NF-kappa B, and increased CD4 helper counts in HIV-positive people. What have you found with meditation and mindset in terms of your research and how it affects cognition and preserves the brain?
Awesome question, and I've recently started meditating. I've skipped a few days. I've missed a few days, but yeah, meditation is really exciting. They've done studies where they've shown that it helps rebuild gray matter in the brain. It, obviously reduces stress. It sort of tunes the parasympathetic nervous system. We tend to spend a lot of our days in this sort of sympathetic overdrive. So it's really good for de-stressing, lengthening telomeres. I mean, that's a wonderful bonus that I would gladly sign up for.
Right.
And reduced inflammation, things like that. So meditation is great. I personally recently, took classes, a form of meditation called Vedic meditation, and it's great. I think that non-scientifically, I think that it's a great opportunity to, from the time we open our eyes in the mornings to the time we go to bed, like that tape is constantly running, and it's a great opportunity to sort of close your eyes and face your inner monologue and like kind of sort through a lot of the thoughts that you're having, which when you don't deal with them face to face, they can become sort of loud and aggressive, but you realize when you're meditating that they're nothing. They're just like, your conscious thoughts are like the ripple on top of the ocean. The subconscious below is far more significant, and that's really who you are.
Right.
And that's kind of what I've gotten out of meditation, which I think is super cool.
Who did you learn from, by the way?
She's a wonderful teacher. Her name is Emily Fletcher.
Okay. My cousin teaches here.
Oh, that's awesome.
Vedic meditation as well.
Vedic meditation? Oh, cool.
Yeah, Hunter Cressman. So I wasn't sure if that was who you learned from or not, but
no, but yeah, it's, whichever way you can learn, I think it's super, super beneficial. I think it's really helpful to just kind of like, it's whatever, we all the ego chatter tends to like be so important and so significant, and like it's something that we are driven by most of the time. But like meditation is a chance to like face those thoughts and be like, come at me, bro. Like, what have you got? Right. And the truth is, like they're really not, they're usually not very significant. So I think I've really enjoyed doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. There's an app I've been using, playing around with. It's called the Muse Meditation app.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, meditationaid.com is the URL, but it's a quantitative EEG device. So it looks at brain waves. So when you're in a high alpha state, these birds chirp. And so it's a way to get that biofeedback going, or it's really neurofeedback. It's pretty unique. So if people don't have access, I know smaller cities there's not a TM or a Vedic meditation course. Insight meditation is also another one if folks are listening, if they want to check that out. But so Max, let's kind of finish off a little bit and talk about your documentary. It's pretty exciting. Tell us like where it's at and kind of what people can expect to learn.
So excited, yeah. So we're working on the film right now. It's called Breadhead. I've been in production on it for the past year and a half at this point, and we spent most of last year filming. We still have some shooting left to do, but now we're sort of entering the editing phase, which I'm really excited about. I mean, that's my favorite part of the whole process is putting together scenes and putting music underneath the timeline. Like I love all that stuff. So we're working on it now, and I hope that I can make the best possible film. If I just wanted to put together some scientific sound bites, I mean, it would probably be out already. But as a filmmaker, and as somebody who's been mostly inspired by narrative stories, by like, TV shows and movies that are not documentary in nature, my hope is to kind of make it feel like that. One of my favorite shows of all time, if not my absolute favorite show of all time, was 6 Feet Under. And so, if I can imbue a little bit of that like Alan Ball magic into my documentary, I mean, that would be an amazing thing for me.
That's cool.
So that's the hope, yeah.
So the website, breadhead.com, people can check that out.
Breadheadmovie.com.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not, we're still definitely a couple months away from it being ready to show anybody, but joining our mailing list is the best way to keep tabs.
Awesome. And the link below this video, we're also at highintensityhealth.com/breadhead. We'll have the link to that, and then people can sign up for your email list and so forth there. So we have 3 final questions we've asked every guest on the show now. We're at, I think, 135 episodes or so. So if there was one herb, nutrient, or botanical, or a whole food substance that you just could not live without, what would it be and why?
Oh man, good question. I feel like I was watching your episode with Kelly Brogan recently, and she said turmeric, right? So I'm not going to say that. I was going to say that. But I would probably say omega-3 fatty acids from fish oil. I don't go anywhere without my bottle of fish oil. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, a lot of good research, particularly in the brain with like the resolvins and so forth and how they affect inflammation, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, DHA is a brain building block, and then EPA, super anti-inflammatory. I'm right now doing a lot of research on how fish oil can improve executive function in the brain. So
ties into this whole, and insulin sensitivity, right? There's some good research there.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool, it's a good one. Covers a lot of bases, right?
Covers a lot of bases, exactly.
That's awesome. So we know that really successful people, high-performing people have a routine in their morning, that they do, whether it's mindfulness, meditation, or exercise. You were just on, I think you said you've been on Dr. Oz 7+ times, right?
Yeah.
So share with us what the first couple hours of your day looks like.
Oh man, well, when I get up in the morning, recently I've been meditating. So I get up, I go pee, drink a glass of water, meditate for 20 minutes. That's been really, really awesome to start every day like that. And then maybe an hour after I wake up, once my cortisol has sort of started to subside, I'll go and reach for the coffee. Big fan of coffee. Maybe I'll blend it up with some MCT oil, some turmeric. Lately I've been putting some black pepper in my coffee. Really good, because we know that piperine enhances the absorption of turmeric. So I'll blend that up, have it over ice. And so the mornings, what I like to do is I like to really kind of focus and respond to emails, kind of do the left brain stuff. And then usually I try to get that out of the way. Late mid-morning to early afternoon, love to get a workout in. And then at a certain point, I will transition over to more creative stuff. So whether it's like, writing a new article or, giving creative notes on a cut of something that I have to look at, then I will, transition over to that. I spend a lot of time on social media, and I find myself easily getting distracted. I tend to follow a lot of science publications, and I'm just like, I'm addicted to research, essentially at this point. Like a new study comes out, it just, I get so excited by just a new puzzle piece to put into my paradigm. So I spend a lot of time reading and kind of doing all that. And then maybe spend some time with family. I'm here in New York. My family's here, go hang out with friends. And I tend to work late into the night. So there are nights when I'm up until 3 a.m, like reading, writing, things like that. So, but yeah, definitely morning is a time for me of left brain, getting the busy work out of the way, putting things on my calendar, planning, scheduling, putting things on my calendar, buying flights for travel, stuff like that.
Right.
So
That's interesting. I'm the opposite. I like to do all creative stuff and then sort of the busy work later. So it's really interesting that, there's no one right thing for any. It's what works for you, right? And so we can translate that paradigm and that mindset into diet. It's some good data there. Something came up that I wanted to talk to you about in your routine. Sorry, I lost the peppering.
Coffee, left brain, right brain. I got family.
I lost track of it. Gosh, it was something important that I was thinking.
It'll come to you.
It's all good. I like your routine, Max. That's awesome. So the final question here we ask every guest on the show, if there was an opportunity for you to meet President Barack Obama or someone from the World Health Organization in an elevator, and you just had a little bit of time, 30, 60 seconds, to share with them a lifestyle or health tip that you would want them to know, but to maybe influence policy around or make some decision around, what comes to mind? What would you want them to know?
Man, really good question. Well, the thing that, if I had time to think about it, there's probably a million things that I'd want to say. But most recently, I became familiar with this expose that the New York Times did, where they found that Coca-Cola, or one of these like large soda manufacturers, was putting money into a nonprofit organization to downplay the role of diet in obesity and type 2 diabetes in this country, and say that it's not diet, it's just that we're not exercising enough. And they were particularly bringing into the fold scientists that were really active on social media to spread this message that like diet didn't matter, drink more soda, eat more refined carbohydrates, processed foods. And I thought that was really infuriating, considering that the latest estimates show or state that 200,000 people worldwide die every year thanks purely to sugar-sweetened beverages, things like that, So that's just like, it was just like something that I read that was like really infuriating, and people are confused enough as it is when it comes to nutrition. And we're like, we live like on the coasts. We're really well informed when it comes to this stuff. There's like a vast gully of people in between, here in LA that really don't know, about nutrition and health and things like that. And they're influenced by these sorts of things, and they're getting sicker and fatter and more diabetic. And it's like, and it's just sad to me. Because I think that a large part of why people are so sick in this country is because of like a lapse in education. I think that people want to be healthy, obviously. People want their families to be healthy and to provide healthy food for their families. They just don't know what is healthy and what isn't. And then, an effort like this comes along, you read about it, and you're like, what the hell? That's like a crime against humanity,
That's really insane.
Yeah.
That's why we have channels like, your platform, my platform, to help people better understand this science that's not being filtered through traditional channels.
Definitely, yeah. That's the holy grail. It's like why what you're doing is so important. I hope that my documentary can reach, a lot of people, because health is important, and being sick sucks, and being sick is expensive, and it really robs us of who we are. So I don't know. I just think that like making it illegal for stuff like that to happen would be awesome.
Yeah. Max, really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you, Mike.
Great work.
Yeah, honored to be here. Thank you.
Awesome.